Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm joined by Pat Flynn. Pat is a Catholic philosopher, prolific author of some of my favorite books, frankly, and he joins us today to talk about God and morality. Pat, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm great, Marcus. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Always great to reconnect with you. And we're dealing with a question that I believe most men in modernity don't want to actually think about, which is the notion of a God necessitates a moral law that's subordinate to him. In other words, God has something to do with how we live our lives morally. Blank slate there, but I invite your comment.
Yeah, I think that it's a good comment to riff off. Does the notion of a God or any God dictate a sort of objective morality? And there I want to say no. There's all sorts of conceptions of God that are actually hard to square with a robust form of what we might call moral realism or common sense morality. And there's certainly very many impoverished notions of God that make morality confusing in the sense that it's not clear exactly how morality and God fit together. So, for example, are things good just because God declares them good? Or are things good independently of God, and so God has to consult something sort of higher than himself to understand the moral dimension and then issue his decrees? That's the famous Euthyphro dilemma. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm interested in is hopefully trying to find a conception of God, or perhaps the conception of God, that can appropriately ground all the sort of relevant features of moral experience. And, of course, I think there is such a conception, and that is classical theism, which, of course, is the understanding of God that comes to us through the Catholic tradition.
So you touched on the Euthyphro dilemma. For the sake of our listeners, let's shed light on that. Let's make sure we understand what the dilemma is, and then from there to go on to this grand scheme within the Catholic framework.
Yeah, good. This is often an objection that you'll hear in various apologetics contexts, but actually it goes back to Plato. Euthyphro is one of his characters, a pagan priest, and he poses the dilemma really originally against the gods, not capital G God, but against the gods. And it's essentially what we just said, is something good because the gods will it, or do the gods will something because it is good? And really, when you translate that against just monotheism, it's supposed to make the theists uncomfortable, and it's supposed to make them uncomfortable because it's trying to force them to say one of two things. Either that morality is entirely arbitrary, that God could have willed something that seems patently and obviously and necessarily evil, and that it would have suddenly been good just because God willed it so. That seems wrong. That seems unacceptable to us. So that's one option that's very unattractive. The other option is that morality in some sense stands independently of God. There's some sort of higher moral standard, principle, or law or whatever that God must himself consult or take under consideration and then sort of order his decrees to that to ensure that they have appropriate conformity. And that's unattractive because whatever else God is supposed to be absolute. The buck always stops with God metaphysically and axiologically or morally as well. So that's how the dilemma is typically posed these days against various forms of theism. And of course, there is a traditional response to it, and I think it's the right response, but it requires a particular conception of God to make it work. And that is you go between the horns of the dilemma, and you identify God with the good itself, and you say that God wills the things he does, not because he has to consult some sort of higher standard, but because God literally is the form of the good and everything acts according to its nature. So that helps to ultimately ground morality in God as the supreme good, but it also helps to ensure that morality is not arbitrary. There are substantive constraints such that it is true that, it could never have been the case that, slandering people for fun was really good, because it could never have been the case that that's something that God could have willed because it's inconsistent with God's nature as the good as such. So it tends to get us sort of all the results we want, I think, with respect to, a sort of objective morality without having to succumb to either horn of the Euthyphro dilemma.
Now, from there, we get to properly think about morality when it comes to God, capital G, the revelation of the one true God. It is wrong to think of God as a distant deity. If anything, as he continues to hold all things in being, there is a moral standard that he expects of his creatures, especially those within his covenant family.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely right. So we touched about on this briefly in an episode or two ago, but I'll give the general sketch again of how Catholics should think of morality metaphysically. And the way it's traditionally been understood is through a theory of natural law. So we all have a particular nature, our human nature, and it's ordered towards a certain end. And for us, the sort of perfection of what we are is to attain ultimate truth and goodness, which is ultimately union with God. That's heaven. That's the beatific vision. But of course, there are various things we can do in life, various courses of action that we can take that can either cause us to flourish, that are conducive to our ultimate end, or that cause us to fail, to make defective judgments, and ultimately to sin. So what morality is really something that's only relevant to rational agents that can deliberate, that can consider the space of reasons, and sort of contingently self-determine themselves. And what God wants of us, what he expects of us, what he demands of us, is that we use our reason well, obviously in cooperation with his grace, to make decisions that conform to the dictates of our nature and ultimately perfect us. And this is where the whole catalog of virtues and everything else comes in, but all obviously oriented towards the ultimate end, which is friendship with God. Now, so that's how we kind of understand morality proximately, through natural law. And there's obviously a great tradition there. Aquinas is perhaps the greatest theologian to articulate the natural law tradition. But what is good for us is really specified by our human nature, and we have our ultimate end, but there's lots of other goods along the way, of course, physical goods, food, friendship, all those sorts of things are really good for us. But it is also important to understand that our nature itself is something that finds grounding in God, because everything that God creates, humans, angels, plants, are in some sense just a finite imitation of the infinite supreme good that God is. And this is known as the traditional theory of the divine ideas, that every sort of essence, right, is just some way that God understands himself as imitable, right, as the way that pure being or pure goodness could be imitated in a finite creaturely way. So while you can do a lot of sort of moral theorizing and a lot of ethical work just by understanding this traditional natural law perspective, it's important to understand that itself ultimately finds its grounding, its constraint, and its ultimate explanation in the form of the good, in the being that is the paradigm good of pure existence, which is God. So it's a really nice theory, because in one sense, you don't have to do a lot of theology to immediately to do a lot of ethics, right? You can do a lot of ethics just from essentialism or natural law, but at some point, to sort of ground the whole system, you're going to need to engage in wider metaphysics and get to philosophy of God, and I think it's classical theism that can really deliver the goods there.
And within this train of thought of classical theism that is able to, I love I'm going to play on words here, deliver the goods for living the good life, because that,
some fun, puns there, right? Yeah.
Living a moral life corresponds to our very nature, therefore. This is what it means to live a good life by virtue of simply the way we've been created. Mm-hmm. We're running out of time in this segment, Pat, but we're going to pick up that train of thought on the other side of the break. I'm talking with Pat Flynn. He is an author, Catholic philosopher, and he and I have been talking about God does have a bearing on our moral life. The reality of a God necessitates an understanding that there is a moral life that has to be made subject and subordinate to his nature. And that's exactly what the Christian revelation teaches, albeit in greater, more loving detail, which we will cover on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Speed. I'm talking with Pat Flynn. He is a philosopher, a Catholic philosopher and author, and he joins us very regularly. And he's joining us today to talk about God and the reality of the moral life. So, as we were touching on earlier, Pat, it is in the nature of the good, and especially the highest good, love, to be diffusive of itself. Therefore, if we really believe in a good God, we necessarily have to believe that he wants to diffuse to us the way to live the good life.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So it's not just that God brings us into being, which is good, and has us oriented towards a certain end. We also believe that God is going to not leave us, totally in the dark about what that end is and how to get there, right? Mm-hmm. That would seem unreasonable, right? That God would will a particular end, but then not give sufficient means for beings like us to reach that end. And that's absolutely true. And of course, there's a lot to that, but I mean, all of us have a basic moral sense. We have conscience, and of course, there's a complicated story with original sin related to that. But beyond that, we have divine revelation, and we have the church as well. So while we can, intuit a lot of the sort of basic and obvious moral truths about what is really good for us, what is not, matters do get complicated, and we do need further guidance. We do need further help, and that is one, but not the only reason of why God has decided to give us the revelation that he has, and not just the revelation, but the ongoing institutional authority that is the Catholic Church as well.
Why the necessity of following the rubrics, the moral rubrics of a particular institution, in this case, the Catholic Church?
Yeah, good. Well, like I said, morality is complicated. So while we often grasp, very broad principles, it is very difficult for even specialists who spend their entire lives in the study of ethics, figuring out how exactly those principles apply in really messy everyday situations, right? So for people who just need to get around in life, and they've got kids and they want to be good people and they've got other jobs, they can't work. It's not reasonable to expect them to be able to work all that out themselves of what to do in every particular situation. So this is why, in general, most of us rely on various authorities, epistemic authorities, moral authorities, that can give us guidance, because it's unreasonable to assume that with our ordinary capacities we can do all of that ourselves. And of course, this is just what the Church is there to help us do, and this is why the Church has various teachings on very specific things, from abortion to just war theory and so on and so forth. She gives us very particular guidance in particular times and places too, because contexts change, cultures, flip over, evolve, and things get what might have been a clear application in one time period might not be so clear or easy in another context. And it would just, despite a grasp that we might have on the basic principles, understanding how they apply and what the right decision is to make in various particular circumstances is a very, very difficult thing to do. And because it's difficult, of course, it would be unreasonable that we would be left in the dark about that, especially if these matters are very morally significant, which things like abortion and euthanasia are very morally significant. It seems like we could very much benefit from having a guide in those areas, and that, again, is exactly what we have in the Catholic Church.
In other words, following the teachings of the Church when it comes to the way we live our moral life is far from a cultish, thoughtless experiment. If anything, it is a well-reasoned approach to living the good life, because, like you mentioned, morality is complex, and therefore trusting in the wisdom of those who have gone before us to reason through these issues is an indescribable blessing.
Yeah, great point, Marcus. So, sometimes people will say, well, you're just leaving reason at the door. You're checking reason at the door when you follow the Catholic Church. I'm going to say, no. What is unreasonable is for you to think that you can do everything by your own reason. Clearly, our cognitive capacities have limits in how far they can reach and in just how frequently they can be applied and how many hours there are in a day. We are naturally wired to rely on various authorities in life, right? We have authorities in medicine. We have authorities, even if we want to go for a hike, we hire trail guides, right? In life, we always understand by the good use of our reason that our reason has limits. And the good use of our reason tells us that there are many areas where the reasonable thing to do is to defer to an authority, and it's actually quite easy for reason to recognize when that is the case and to recognize who or what a good authority might be, whether it's an individual or institution. And the unreasonable thing to do is to continue to ignore those authorities when they're clearly needed and think that you can just reason it out yourself. Like somebody who thinks, oh, I don't need a doctor for this, I'll take care of it myself. No, that's unreasonable, right? And nobody is checking their reason at the door because they defer to a relevant expert or authority, and nobody ever thinks this when it comes to medicine or anything like that, right? It's so obvious. I just would like to suggest that it's as obvious, if not more obvious, when it comes to matters of salvation.
In fact, if anything, it should be, and that should be the primary category with which we employ our reason when it comes to the moral life. And therefore, that also raises the... Okay, so recently, the New York Times published an op-ed where the commentator described the church's teaching on sexual morality as, quote-unquote, an obsession with pelvic theology. There's no talking about... There's some humor there, but there's also tremendous repulsion for me, because there is no talking about moral life by fragmenting different parts. There's no such thing as, this is what I do in my privacy, and then there's a kind of public moral life. There's an integral whole here if we are to think about moral life under the auspices of God rightly.
Yeah, of course. And as soon as you said the New York Times, I knew something particularly obnoxious was about to follow, and I was not disappointed there. And yeah, you're right, of course, right? The whole of the human person, like morality isn't something that just has like one little slice of our life, right? No, everything we do effectively is of moral significance. Now, some things of much greater significance than other things, right? And Catholics, of course, have the distinction between mortal and venial sins. But we are shaping our character constantly by the kinds of decisions we make. Decisions we make to eat, the decisions we make of how we use our speech in conversation, and of course the decisions we make of whether or not to restrain our various appetites, including and especially the sexual appetite. There's a reason that even though if the sexual sins are maybe not like the worst of all the mortal sins, that it has been reiterated, particularly at Fatima, that they seem to be the sins that would send most people to hell because they're so easy to fall into, right? So if anything, they do deserve a huge amount of attention, especially since our culture is clearly so sick from sexual sins these days. And I'm willing to bet the New York Times didn't give much by way of argument, probably complaint and accusations about the Catholic Church being obsessed with sex, when it tends to be the secular outlets that keep talking about it nonstop, right?
Well, no, you're right. They did not give anything by way of a rational argument, but there was a lot of virtue signaling in those Catholics and their hierarchy and the obsession with this pelvic theology. Look how grotesque they are, which is hilarious to me, because the sexual morality teaching of the Church is the only thing that creates a flourishing society, especially when it comes to marriage and the family and children flourishing within the familial framework.
Yeah, particularly, you do not have to go deep into any sort of, traditional natural law, theology manual to understand that people become quite barbaric when they are overruled by their sexual appetites. And of course, again, morality is a rational enterprise. And what has long been agreed upon by the great thinkers in the tradition about morality is it involves getting your appetites under the control of reason. And the sexual appetite it's good. It's there for a reason. But if it gets disordered and gets out of place, oh man, so many horrible things, follow from that, as sadly we know in today's society.
You know what? That's a crucial point. That private moral failings don't stay within. You know how they like to argue, well, what happens in my bedroom or whatever happens behind closed doors. Well, no, they don't stay that way. Even if you don't believe in
right. What's happening in your bedroom has led to the abortion, right? Catastrophe that is our society. You're exactly right. These things do not just stay in one's bedroom. But even if they did, that doesn't mean that that's okay, because we all have an obligation to care for our neighbor. So if you are degrading yourself and committing sins just in the confines of your own property, it's a great assumption that I certainly don't accept, that nobody should care about that, right? That itself is a moral assumption that should be outright rejected. So there's just so many just false claims suffused within these types of pieces. It's hard to even know where to begin half the time, right?
Yeah, and okay, so from there, then we can rightly think about the grander picture, which is this is why knowing how the human person works, i.e., knowing the basis of his creation, therefore how he ought to operate, is crucial, and that's why knowing the mind of the Creator is so crucial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And right, so from the sort of grand scheme of things, right, the good is self-diffusive. It not only leads to a great chain of being, because God wants to diffuse his goodness, he wants to create many different kinds of being. It leads to what's called the great circle of being, right, that God brings forth everything into existence, but ultimately orients it back towards the highest good that he can possibly give everything, which is himself. Now, not all things can be united to God in friendship's love, because not all things are rational beings, but that's what's really unique about human beings, is we are the sort of fusion between the spiritual realm and the material realm, that in a real metaphysical sense, when God invites us into union with himself, he's sort of bringing all of creation along for the ride. But because we are not just disembodied spirits, we're not angels, we're rational animals, there's so much to the moral life that has to do with our physicality or animality. And the sexual appetite is just one of them, but it's one that is for many people the cause of very serious sin. So I know we're running out of time here. Hopefully we covered enough points to, give the impression of how morality and God link up in Catholic theology. But yeah, I'll pause there. Let you have the last word, Marcus.
Thank you so much. My guest has been Pat Flynn, Catholic philosopher, author. Look up his writings and stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.